As a man who has reached the ripe old age of 48, I can promise you I've seen some shit go down. This one totally takes the cake for me though. I was waiting out front of a truck stop back in the mid-80s, sitting on a park bench with a guy who had a big Rottweiler kind of dog on a leash with him. I tried to make small talk, but he was quite a sourpuss. So we sat in silence for a few minutes until the most unexpected thing I have ever seen happened right before my very eyes. While we were sitting there, a big 18-wheeler pulls in without a trailer, so he parks right up front like a normal car would. Inside the cab of the truck with the driver is a little monkey, the dance for the organ grinder kind. I think they are called rhesus monkeys, perhaps. Well, the dog spots this lil monkey and proceeds to go apeshit over it, lunging at the end of his leash and barking at the top of his lungs, generally making a real spectacle of himself, to say the least. The driver is obviously upset, but not nearly as much as the monkey is. Actually, upset may be the wrong adjective to use for the monkey, though. In retrospect, I think eagerly aggressive may be a more appropriate description for his disposition. He was pacing the dashboard back and forth, never taking his eyes off this very aggravating dog. The driver opens his little triangle window that they don't make on cars anymore, the ones made for smokers back in the day. He yells out to this douchebag to call his dog off because it is upsetting his monkey. The guy laughs and says, "No way. I told you he was a jerk, didn't I?" He says that his dog ain't bothering nobody. The dog hasn't shut up since he laid eyes on the monkey. I promise you he is bothering everybody for several blocks around. Now here's where things start to get interesting. The driver says that if he doesn't call his dog off, he's gonna let his monkey loose on that dog. Douchebag laughs and says that his dog would eat that monkey alive. Upon hearing this, the driver leans over and reaches into his glove box, I guess. He pulls out one of those tiny baseball bats like you used to get at Astro World or carnivals and places it in the monkey's hand. The monkey obviously knows what's about to go down, because he's now trying to squeeze out of that little triangular window I mentioned earlier. This monkey has murder in his eyes if I've ever seen it. The driver hollers, "Last chance to save your dog's ass, man." In response, douchebag lets his dog off the leash. Now we have a situation that has escalated to the point where we have a dog jumping up at the window and a monkey screaming profanities right back at him. Well, the driver finally rolls down the regular window and out leaps all kinds of miniature primate hell. The dog never knew what hit him. Quick as a flash, this monkey is riding on the back of this dog's neck, his two back feet all wrapped up in his neck fur, with one hand hanging onto an ear. The other hand, as you may have guessed by now, is steadily and mercilessly raining down blows about this dog's head and face. I mean hard blows. You can hear them whap, whap, whap. Well, it only took a moment for the dog to realize he was in way over his head. He bolts, yelping bloody murder as he runs away at full speed. I mean, this dog is running so fucking hard he's throwing up tufts of grass and dirt as soon as he leaves pavement. The monkey is still riding him and beating on him the whole time. Douchebag acts like he wants to fight now, but several people, including myself, stepped in to stop that nonsense. In a couple of minutes or so, the little monkey comes loping back with his little bat still in hand and leaps up into the still open window of the truck to await his master, who has gone on into the store. That wanker ran off to try to go find his dog, but I don't know if he ever did. My ride showed up and I had to go. Never again in this lifetime will I see something so totally crazy and unexpected like that. I am both fortunate and humble to have been so privileged to be present for such an event.
This is actually my mom's story, and I'll be recounting it from her personal perspective. The villain of this tale is actually deceased and never technically encountered any of the characters. So it's a story that I'm sure everyone involved wished they had never had the displeasure of crossing paths with. It was early December in 2005 when my brother, Alex, and his wife's fourth child had just started first grade. With her having full days of school, they had more time to pick up extra hours and prepare for Christmas. All he could find at the time was work with companies where he would drive a work truck to different counties in our state, making deliveries between businesses that weren't worth using a big semi-truck for. After the significant snowstorm we had in '99 that trapped us all at home for weeks, none of us liked the idea of him being on the road, but you know your uncle. He couldn't stand the idea of having nothing under the tree on Christmas. I didn't even want to go with him. When he asked me, I had the worst feeling about it, but the weather channels all said the storm wouldn't last, and I was the only one with a cell phone, so I couldn't let him go out there alone. If something happened and he froze to death because he couldn't call for help, I don't know if I would be able to live with myself. So I dropped you off at your aunt's house and told your father I'd be back in a few days. That was it. That was the start of it all. It was a route he'd done 100 times by that point. But the weather channel was wrong. By the time we were nearing the Vermont border and the mountains came into view, every single one of them didn't have a speck of color on them. Everything around us was white. There were points when all we could do was follow the tire tracks on the road from vehicles in front of us and hope they didn't go off the road. We were starting to lose the light by the time we were closing in on Burlington, Vermont, and we figured that would be as good a place as any to spend the night. I hate cities, but driving those roads in the dark wasn't an option. We only had to travel through the back way to Montpelier, and then it was smooth sailing on the interstate right into Burlington. In the morning, we could reassess our route and cut through to New Hampshire, and from there toward the city. I remember we filled up at a gas station, and it was so cold that when we brought our coffees to the van, they didn't even burn our mouths. Nothing but ice out there, but we were sure we could make it to the interstate, and then the roads would be clear. So we kept going, even though we felt uneasy about it. We were talking about what we were getting you kids for Christmas, and where we'd be getting together for Christmas dinner that year when we hit the mountain. I said to him, "We should turn around and go back. This isn't safe." For a minute I thought he'd listen, but then he shifted the gear on the van and said, "Go back to what?" He was right. We hadn't seen anything since we got our coffees, and they were stone cold by then. It was actually okay for a while. We were following another car stuck behind a plow, so the safest place to be at that time. Or so we thought. The next part is always a bit hazy for me. We saw the snowplow jerk toward the edge of the mountainside, and we were so afraid of it going through the bars and off the side of the mountain that I didn't even consider what it was jerking away from until I heard Alex yell. I was watching the snowplow trying to right itself and keep on the road, and I didn't even have time to look out the windshield to see what he was yelling about before the car in front of us hit us. When everything stopped moving, my coffee was everywhere. On me, the windshield, my phone, everything. My chest was on fire, and my legs felt like they'd been hit by a car. I checked my phone first thing, but no good. It was gone. So much for calling for help. The next thing I checked was my brother. His mouth was bleeding, and his eyes were closed, but when I said his name and shook him, he groaned. At least I knew he was alive. All I could see in front of us was ice and rock, so I had no idea about the other driver's states, but I had to get to a phone and get help. I told him to stay put and got out of the car. Of course, he didn't listen to me because he never does. So, before I could even register what I was looking at, he was behind me, calling my name and telling me not to leave him. In front of us was a large work truck, and right in the front of it was the car that was in front of us. I couldn't move. They had to be dead. No one could have survived that. But Alex ran the best he could, holding his chest and stumbling around the car and pried open the passenger door to the truck. I finally snapped out of my daze when he told me to stay away from the truck, and my heart sank. Were we the only ones who survived? That's the day I realized that hell wasn't a place. Being all alone on that mountain, surrounded by metal, rocks, freezing cold wind, ice, and dead bodies, with no way to get help and miles away from anyone or anything. That was the worst feeling I've ever experienced. There was another vehicle that wasn't there, someone who might be alive. The snowplow was gone. There was a big dent in the guardrails, and we couldn't see him. He must have left to get help. What else could we think? No one who's not pure evil could see what we saw and not stay to help unless they knew they needed to get the police. I was about to mention the snowplow when he finally got the door open. I had to stop before I got to the door. It smelled like a brewery mixed with pennies. I knew that smell. Enough alcoholics are in our family to recognize it. Alex cursed and tumbled back out of the truck, and I went to him to help him up, trying to ignore the fresh blood on his clothes and the increasingly strong smell of alcohol and blood filling my nose from the now open door. "The radio's dead! The thing won't even start!" he snarled, gripping his chest again. I started to tell him my thoughts on the plow when we heard a horrible scream that made us both flinch away from the panic behind it. I practically dropped Alex on the ground, racing back around to the front of the truck to the car. Inside was a young girl. She was beautiful, with brown hair and blonde highlights, a lilo and stitched shirt, and the most beautiful blue eyes I'd ever seen. They were filled with tears and terror. She was confused and screaming in between words, reaching out to me, and I grabbed her hands. Alex, in a rush to get to me and get me away from the scene, crashed into me. and she cried out when my hands were pulled from hers. But I was right back at the window within seconds, pushing him away from me. "We'll get you out, honey, I promise." I turned on Alex as he tugged on me again. He had to have some sort of idea, right? He could get her. One door was already pried open, we could do another. But his eyes were wide when he looked at me and he wouldn't say a word. Coming from a guy who has never stopped talking since the day he was born, his silence was deafening. I met his eyes, then followed his gaze to where he was looking, and a fresh wave of tears sprang up. Right underneath the feet of stitch on her shirt, and the bit of her stomach that was showing with how she was sitting, there was only solid metal. The rest of her couldn't even be seen. She didn't seem to understand what happened to make me react like that and started panicking again when she followed our eyes, realizing what we did. She began panicking all over again, begging us to tell her where her legs were. I shushed her, holding her hands tight and promising her that she'd be okay. That help was coming and they'd get her out. I don't know how long I stood there. Alex eventually went back to the truck and the mostly undamaged back of ours to see if he could find anything to help us fight off the cold, but there wasn't much. He even searched the area and the trash that fell out of the drunk man's truck, but no luck there either. I gave her my jacket after we put on every piece of clothing that we brought with us for the trip. She was getting cold though, and her voice was getting weaker, more quiet. It was completely dark by then. All we could see was what the snow allowed us, along with our flashlights that would run out of battery eventually. Alex tried to convince me to get back into our vehicle, to get out of the wind, but I just couldn't leave her. When I looked into her eyes, all I could see was you when you were that age one day. She wasn't even 20 yet, trying to get home for Christmas. She told me about her family, college, and her life up to that point, including her asshole boyfriend who was supposed to come with her but canceled at the last minute to spend the holidays with his friends instead. She decided before the end that it was a good thing, though. She said he was a good man, and he didn't deserve to die like this, too. She was much calmer by this point, not even acknowledging the fact that she was practically in half. I think deep down she knew she wasn't going home and needed someone to listen to her, as she tried to make sense of how this could be how her life was going to end. She kept mentioning how cold it was getting, but as soon as Alex noticed me removing my layers of clothing to give to her, he scolded me, demanding that I keep bundled up as much as possible. He told me that she was already dead, and we're the ones who needed the warmth, not her. I knew he was right, but I cursed him anyway, shoving him away from her. Even if she, too, knew he was right, he didn't need to say that in front of her. She had even grown quiet after some time, us giving each other assurances that everything would be okay, instead of the conversation from before. By that time, I was struggling against the cold even with Alex hugging me, trying to keep the wind on his back and off of me. That's when we heard sirens in the distance. My brother and I looked at each other, and without even saying anything or showing any emotion, he staggered and limped as fast as he could toward them. He held the flashlight over his head and waved it. He couldn't yell without devolving into coughs and spitting up more blood, but gritting his teeth against the pain, hand on his chest, he waved the light all over the road toward the sirens. Eventually, we saw the lights of police, firefighters, and ambulances. I told her they were coming, that they'd help her and this would all be over, but she didn't react. She gave me a sad smile, and it broke my heart into a million pieces. I knew that she knew by then that she wasn't going to make it, but seeing the acceptance mixed in with the fear on her face and hearing how thankful she was that I was with her and how lucky my daughter was to have me in her life was more than I could take. I let go of her hand and did what my brother couldn't. I stood and jumped, waving the flashlight over my head and screaming that we needed the ambulance over here, that she needed help. They listened and rushed over as fast as they could, but Alex was right. There was no helping her. She got to call her mother on one of the EMT's phones and tell her she loved her, along with some other messages to her other family members. Then they moved her to try to get her out, and that was it. They took me away in the ambulance after they ensured her pulse had stopped. She was dead. The drunk guy was dead. My brother could be dying for all I knew, and none of it felt real. My brother and I were allowed to ride in an ambulance together. It was against protocol, but given what we just went through and how devastated I was, they allowed it. I think Alex would have attacked them if they tried to separate him from me at that point. Regardless, he wasn't letting me out of his sight until we were in a building with heat and off that mountain. Once we got to the hospital, they took him away, and I was alone. So I called your father, told him where I was and the gist of what happened. Then I called your aunt, told her even less of what happened and that I would call her the second I heard anything about Alex. She had to wake you up since it was almost 3 a.m, but I had to hear your voice. Now it's 2021, and when it's cold outside, my skin burns as if being stabbed by heated needles. Alex had so much blood in his lung by the time they arrived that he still has breathing problems. We both had broken ribs that healed, and the surgery I had on my legs went fine. It's 2021, and we're alive. We got to come home and have Christmas and all the Christmases since then. I saw you grow up to be the age that poor girl was and then surpass her. I never went to her funeral or met her family. I've always regretted that. These days, I don't even remember her voice, her family's names, or what school she went to. I don't remember where her boyfriend went for Christmas instead of going home with her. I don't remember how her hands felt or the smell of her shampoo in her hair. Hell, most of the time, it doesn't even feel like she was a real person, like it was a horrible dream or something that happened to someone else. But that smile she gave me at the end, how she knew it was over, but was too scared to actually say it. How one of her last acts was to reassure me that she knew she was going to die, and that it was all going to be okay, just like we said. That I will never forget.
This is a story I grew up hearing my mom tell me. I was really young when this happened, and I know for a fact it was before I was 5. I only have some foggy memory of the event, especially because my mom at the time didn't want to freak me out. Some context. First, we have family all over the country. I remember spending so much of my childhood on road trips from state to state to visit family. So we know our ins and outs of traveling. Second, when I was a child, I would randomly hug strangers and tell them I loved them. I was so filled with joy and love that it just spilled over onto other people. There was basically only one stranger I never immediately latched onto the second I saw them, and this is that story. So, my mom was taking me to visit some relatives while my dad was staying at home with my brothers. She had to go house sit, and in general, she is a better caretaker of me than my father, so it made sense that I went with her. We were driving for hours until we finally hit a rest stop and got out to use the restroom. Now there was already this guy in the parking lot, and according to my mom, it looked like he was watching everyone who was entering and leaving the rest stop. The second we got out of the car, he did too. My mom held my hand as we headed into the restroom, but immediately picked up on the fact that I let go of her hand to hold her other hand, the side away from the man. Looking back, she told me that it was clear that somewhere in my tiny child brain, I picked up some sign of danger because I avoided the man as much as I could and would quicken my pace to the restroom and car. I never did that with another stranger ever again. I had never blatantly avoided another adult like that. Anyways, we do our business and head back to the car, and the man had gone back to his car and watched us leave, only to then follow us in his own car. My mom immediately realized what was going on and tried to shake him off on the highway. He wouldn't budge and tried to get as close as he could. Apparently, while doing this, a semi-truck driver noticed how frantic and off she was driving and could see her looking back at his car. He realized what was going on and drove up to her side and kind of made eye contact with her, and they were on the same page from then on out. Turns out the driver called up on his radio to other truckers and told them what was going on, and a bunch of drivers from different routes nearby came onto the same highway we were traveling on. A few minutes later, they began blocking out the guy's car and essentially trapping him away from my mother and me as she turned onto an exit to get off the highway to another rest stop, while the original truck driver followed us in. He got out and talked to my mom, told her he picked up on what was happening, asked us if we were okay, and drove with us to a Burger King and got us something to eat. We talked, and he followed us back onto the road until eventually we went our separate routes. So to the guy who was probably going to try to kidnap my mom and me, let's not meet. To the truck driver who probably saved our lives, thank you.